So let me welcome everyone to our webinar, which is a regular event with the International Iranian Economic Association. Today's discussion is focused on tariffs, which are like sanctions and trade and international trade and impact of tariffs with particularity with oil producing in countries and Iran. We are very fortunate to have two speakers, both Iranian scholars with established records of research in this area. The first speaker, Mostafa Beshkar, professor of economics at IU Indiana, a place I know a thing or two about. I served there for many years. Mostafa's work has both theoretical and empirical dimensions, and has discussions with trade models and trade theories, and he specializes down to the case of developing economies. And we asked him to give us his views about tariffs generally, but also because tariffs have become such a big topic as we speak. Mostafa has extensive publications in the area and some joint work. Again, established trade researchers, and he will be the first speaker. Next, I will introduce Saleh Tabrizy, associate professor at Oklahoma University, also with a very extensive record of research in trade and development. We thought it might be best, because of the overlap between the presentations, to have the Q&A postponed to the end. So each speaker will have 30 minutes, and then we will reserve about 10, 15, 20 minutes at the end of both talks to do the Q&A. And if you have comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A, and in the end, we'll try to address as many of them as possible, or even call upon some commentators if they wish to speak their points. Mostafa, please feel free to go ahead and link your presentations. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. So let me share. So you should see my screen now, right? Okay. All right. Thank you, Esfandiar, for the introduction and for the invitation. So the subject of my paper today is reciprocity in trade agreements. So for a long time, this was a rather obscure subject, but now you cannot escape all the media coverage on this. And I welcome that attention to this kind of work, but also at the same time, it has made it very politicized. This has become a very politicized topic to the extent that we have, even in the review process, we are pressured to mind the political implications of this. So this is an interesting time to talk about these issues, and I look forward to your any comments and feedback that you might have. So this is a joint work with Pauli Chang and Shenji Song. Pauli is a professor at Singapore Management University, and Shenji was a PhD student there, and now she has graduated. So, so there is a renewed push for reciprocity in trade agreements. So reciprocity is one of the foundational principles in the GATT and the WTO. This is in the text of the GATT and also in the text of the WTO, that tariff cuts must result in an equal exchange of concessions. So in general, there are some exceptions, especially for developing countries and least developed countries, that they should follow a relaxed reciprocity. So there is not like a very strict reciprocity requirement for them. And also the US, especially under the GATT, so did not insist on reciprocity that much, especially with respect to Europe and other allies to help them rebuild after the World War II. But more recently, especially in the last 10 years or so, so in the US, many politicians are complaining about the lack of reciprocity in the WTO. So famously, Trump, in an address to the General Assembly of the United Nations, he said that we believe that trade must be fair and reciprocal. The United States will not be taken advantage of any longer. So this kind of sentiment is very common in the US and in some other countries as well. So here we would like to think about potential causes of this renewed push for reciprocity. And the reason that I use this title for this slide is that, as I said, reciprocity has been the norm and the rule in the WTO and the GATT for a long time. But what has happened that all of a sudden now governments, especially the US government, is so concerned about reciprocity and they are complaining about it. So there could be, one of the reasons could be that there is an erosion of reciprocity. That is, over time, the existing trade agreements may have become less favorable to big powers. So it could have started as a reciprocal agreement, and then because of changes in economic fundamentals, for example, this might have changed. So another reason could be political or geopolitical. This is also extensively studied in political science, that there has been a transition from a hegemonic world order where countries that once insisted or embraced unilateral liberalization as a form of global leadership, they are now placing greater emphasis on reciprocity. So they used to be trying to lead the free world or the liberal order by giving concessions to other countries, opening up their markets to other countries in exchange for political alliance, for example. And that might have changed, and that could be another reason for it. Or it could be just an idiosyncratic Trump effect. That is, this is just a misguided populist narrative that may trade a scapegoat for deeper economic anxieties. So in this paper, we are going to focus on the first potential reason, and which has some relations with the second potential reason for this renewed push for reciprocity. But our focus would be on whether reciprocity has changed over time or not. Okay, so what we do here, we want to quantify the balance of concessions under existing trade agreements, like the WTO and its associated free trade agreements from 1995, when the WTO was established, to 2018, which is a couple of years after Trump came to power. So the key premise of this work is that the balance of concessions may change over time due to changes in economic fundamentals. Trade imbalances is one famous example. Like trade balances have changed substantially over time that could have some impact, and economic sizes of countries have changed. So China, for example, has become a much larger country, and the US has become relatively smaller as a share of the world GDP. And there could be also preference shocks, and that could lead to different preferences for trade agreements, as a result, a different perception of concessions that are exchanged. And change in applied tariffs could be another reason, that there are FTAs that are formed, and that changes trade all over the world, even if FTA is regional, and that could also affect reciprocity. At the same time, an important point here is that the obligations under the WTO are basically fixed since 1995. There are some changes, but there is not much adjustment in the obligations that countries have under the agreement. So given that the world has changed, but obligations are basically the same as before, then this could lead to a change in the balance of concessions over time. So what we do here, we develop alternative bargaining environments, multilateral bargaining environments, to analyze tariff concessions. And we quantify concessions using a quantitative trade model concessions that countries receive and grant. And also, we want to quantify the effect of trade imbalances as one of the parameters that have changed substantially over time. Okay, so let me give you a preview of the result. I know that I have not defined what concession is, but I will define that very soon. But let me show you this general result that we have here, that here on this graph, I hope it's big enough for you to see. So this graph shows the net concessions of selected countries over time. This is in billions of dollars. And these are like, you can think of it as the amount of money that one country is giving to the other country on net as a result of this trade, as a result of this concession. So the US started with something like almost $30 billion in 1995 as net concessions to the rest of the world. And the net concession of the US to the rest of the world went up to almost $80 billion a year. And some other countries like EU, they expanded their net concessions and then it declined. And countries like Korea and Japan, they are receiving more concessions than they are giving to the rest of the world. So we basically see a deviation from reciprocity, because if the agreement was reciprocal for all countries, it would be basically net concessions should be zero, but we see that they are not, and they are expanding. This deviation from reciprocity is expanding. The second graph that I want to show you here is that, so here we have the balance of concession of the US again, but under two scenarios. One is under the factual scenario, the current trade volumes, which is given by the blue bars. It's the same as what you see here, but the red bars are under a counterfactual where trade is balanced. Suppose that everything else is the same, but the parameters of the model change so that trade is balanced. And you see that all of a sudden that reduces the net concessions of the US by 50%. So which is a big number. And that shows that trade imbalances have been one of the reasons why trade agreements have become, have gone farther away from reciprocity. Okay, so let's look at the theory. We first look at the very simple two-country model. So, of course, the important measure that we want to define here is concession. What is concession in trade agreements? So let me just review this very quickly, that this is just from a simple, it's a textbook example where you have import demand function, which is given by this orange line, and the export supply function of the foreign country. And if you have free trade, suppose that, so the price is PA under free trade or under agreement, and the quantity is QA. And if you impose a tariff, this tariff is going to create a wedge between the exporter price and importer price, and that wedge is basically the tariff, right? But here the point is that if the importing country is a significant importer, it's large enough, so it's going to push down the world price to PN. So this is the terms of trade deterioration for the foreign countries, for the exporting countries. So the exporting countries have to bear part of this, the cost of this tax. So this is the incidence of tax on the foreigners. And this box here reflect the terms of trade gains of the exporting country when tariffs are eliminated. Okay, so we consider this, we use this as a measure of concession in trade agreements. This is basically the cost of your taxation that is imposed on foreigners. And when you remove the trade barriers, that's given back to the foreign countries. Okay, so the theoretical justification for this is that, so there is a very large literature on this, that terms of trade externalities are the primary source of inefficiency in unilateral tariff choices. That is, if countries choose their tariffs unilaterally, they are going to impose this externality on each other. And what the trade agreement can do to improve efficiency is basically to get rid of those terms of trade externalities. And Bagwell-Steger made this point, and then there are several papers, empirical and theoretical papers, that basically show that this is relevant in the real world. For example, we see that unilateral tariffs are not consistent with real consumption maximization, right? So when you look at tariffs that countries use without an agreement, these tariffs are usually much higher than what you would expect if they were trying to maximize their real consumption. But these tariffs are very strongly correlated with the country's ability to manipulate their terms of trade. And that's the externality that they have. And so this shows that this terms of trade externality is in fact deriving the choice of unilateral tariffs and also the choice of tariffs under an agreement. And then in the GATT and the WTO, when you look at the retaliatory measures, which are supposed to be reciprocal, they are normally calibrated to recover the cost of disputed tariffs. That is, if I impose a tariff on a country in violation of my agreement, that the retaliation from the other country is going to be such that it recovers the cost of this increased tariffs, which is in practice is not exactly calculated as terms of trade because that's hard to calculate, but it is related to the terms of trade effect of tariffs. Okay, so to show the first result I want to show you, the first theoretical result is the effect of trade imbalances. So think about a very simple two-country model. The only thing that I need to highlight here, which is a bit different from the standard models, is that here we allow for trade deficit. That is, the expenditure of a country, which is the basically expenditure on your own goods and expenditure on foreign goods, is going to be limited by your income, of course, your tariff revenues that you get, and also your trade deficit. So trade deficit here is defined as basically your ownership of foreign assets. If you have trade deficit, it's because you own a fraction of foreign assets, and so that generates income for you, which is added to your income. And as a result, you are going to import more than you are exporting. And yeah, so DH and DF are basically the net imports of country H and F. That's the trade deficit. Okay, so if I want to show you with a very simple offer curve here. Here we have the red line is the offer curve of the home country, that on the horizontal axis you have quantity of home exports, on the vertical axis you have quantity of home imports, and the red curve is basically the offer curve of the home country, and the blue curve is the offer curve of the foreign country. In the equilibrium, if let's start from this initial tariff I. So you basically have if countries are imposing their high tariffs, in this case they are imposing similar tariffs 100%. So this is going to be the equilibrium. Once they eliminate these tariffs, they go up to point A. So the offer curves expand, and point A is the new equilibrium. So here, this line that you see here represents the terms of trade of the home country here, that the terms of trade has remained fixed here, which is not surprising because the two countries are symmetric and the tariff cuts are also symmetric. So the terms of trade is not affected. But the agreement, so basically if the agreement reduces tariffs in this manner, we would say that the terms of trade has remained fixed and this agreement is reciprocal. But now let's think about the shock to the balance of trade. And a proposition that we have theoretically is that if there is an increase in alpha, which is the share of the foreign assets that is owned by the home country, if that increases, which means that when trade deficit expands, then this is going to improve the terms of trade for the home country, for the country that has a trade deficit. So basically, if you have a reciprocal agreement and you increase trade deficit, this is going to change the balance of concessions on the agreement, and it's going to change it in favor of the country that has increased trade deficit. Okay, so in the case of the US, in 1990s, for example, the US had, early 1990s, had balanced trade. So whatever the balance of concessions was at the time, now it is probably more in favor of the foreign countries because US has an expanded trade deficit compared to that time. So this is a theory that we get in a two-country model. And just for illustration, so when you reduce your tariffs from the initial non-cooperative tariffs to agreement tariffs, this is under balanced trade, which you can think of it as the WTO agreement in 1993, where US had the balanced trade. And so it could have been a reciprocal agreement at that time. But the same tariff cut, now that there is a balanced trade, a shock to the trade balance, is not going to be reciprocal anymore. If you look at this graph on the right, so this is basically the same tariff cut, but now with the trade deficit. And you see that the terms of trade, which is represented by the slope of this line and this line, so the dashed line is the terms of trade under the trade war, and the solid line is the terms of trade under free trade or the agreement. You see that they are not, the slope is not the same, and the terms of trade of the home country now deteriorate. So this is the same countries. The only difference is that now we have a trade deficit. So this is going to be our prediction, that we think that just because of this, if you keep the tariffs fixed, but introduce a trade balance shock in this way, the country that has expanded trade deficit is going to be giving more concession than it receives under the same agreement. Okay, so one point that one decision or one assumption that we have to make here is that what is this? What we observe is that the trade under the agreement, but we have to decide what is going to be the trade equilibrium when the agreement collapses and countries go to a non-cooperative tariff. So what we do, we basically assume that any country, any member country has the option to terminate its trade policy cooperation with another member. There is no really external force that can coerce countries to abide with the agreement, so they can just leave at any moment they like. And cooperation, and if we do see cooperation is enforced by bilateral retaliation. Okay, so basically, if you increase your tariff against one country, you are going to face retaliation from that country, but not from all other countries. So these retaliations are not coordinated, which is consistent with the WTO law. And the trade war tariffs could change over time due to a change in economic fundamentals, right? So when China was a small country, its trade war tariffs were different from now, because now it has a lot more market power, and the trade war tariffs could also change. So there is a paper that looks at the same problem, and they achieved a completely different result, and that's what I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on. So the paper by Bone and co-authors, including Steger, Caliendo, and Paro, and Sykes, so they use pre-WTO tariffs as the non-cooperative outcome. So we use the Nash tariffs that we are going to calculate, but what they use is the tariffs that are applied before the WTO formation in 1993. And they argue that this is what the WTO requires. So the WTO says if you want to get rid of your obligations, you have to go back to the tariffs before the agreement was signed. So the main difference between these two approaches is that US tariffs were already very low in early 1990s, while China had very high tariffs. I think, if I remember correctly, so US tariffs were something like 6 or 7% on average. China's tariffs were closer to 50% at that time. So basically, their outside option or their trade war situation is a situation where US would impose a 7% tariff, China would impose a 50% tariff. And but Nash tariffs that we calculate, they are more symmetric. That is, if we go to trade war, US and China's tariffs are not that different anymore. So this is obviously a big difference, and that leads to different results that we get from this analysis. And of course, Nash tariffs could also change over time depending on trade flows and country sizes and so forth. Okay, so a quantitative model that we use, we have this quantitative model which is very standard in the literature, and it uses a nested CES Cobb-Douglas preference that consumers have a CES preference across varieties of the same good from different countries, and they have a Cobb-Douglas preference across different sectors. This is a common preference. And then technology also is a constant unit level requirement. You can think of it as like a Ricardian model or an Armington model, basically. Okay, so the budget constraint here, what is a bit different from some of the more standard models is that we have a trade deficit here, and we allow for trade deficit, which is, as I said, is exogenous. It's we calibrate the model to so that your ownership of foreign assets is going to justify the trade deficit that you have. So we are going to calibrate alpha that I mentioned before to generate the trade deficits that we observe in the data. Okay, so I think to save time, I'm just going to jump into the results. So the trade data is also quite standard. We look at trade flows and all the data from 1995 to 2018, and trade elasticities, which are going to be important in our calculations, are taken are estimated using Caliendo and Paro, and we have a few robustness checks that we use a variety of trade elasticities in the literature. Okay, so the first result I want to show you here, this is for 2018, and these bars show the net concession of each country to the rest of the world. That is, the terms of trade concessions that you have given to the rest of the world, minus terms of trade concessions that you have received. And as you see here, US has the largest net concession in 2018, and Korea has the most concessions received. And so this shows an obvious deviation from reciprocity, because a reciprocal agreement would have 0 for everyone. And this is the graph I showed you at the beginning, where the US terms of trade concessions has grown over time, and Korea has received more and more concessions over time. And we see that China used to be a country that received net concessions. Now it provides or gives positive concessions to the rest of the world, but that's still much smaller than the United States. So this is for the bilateral relationships between the US and other countries. EU is the largest recipient of net concessions from the US. China is the second largest, and again, this is in 2018. And then we have Mexico, Canada, and Japan. These are the usual suspects. And here in this graph, we show US versus China. So the red bars shows the terms of trade concessions that US has given to China. So the net concessions are going to be given by this black line, which is a function of concessions that you give minus concessions that you receive. And you see that that is also increasing between the US and China over time. And US has become, is paying something like $15 billion a year in terms of trade gains to China. Okay, so now about the trade balance shocks, which is one of the main.
Mostafa, 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm good with that. So as I said, this is if you are familiar with Kehoe rule and Steinberg paper, they try to understand the growing trade deficit in the US. And one of the points they make is that in early 1990s, no one expected such a huge expansion in trade deficit in the US. So in 1992 or 3, the US trade was almost completely balanced. But over time, it started growing up, and that they relate this to something that they call saving glut in this literature. And so the view from our paper is that if this was unexpected, the agreement was written assuming that trade is going to be balanced. And now that trade is not balanced, that might push us further away from reciprocity. And what we see here is that, as I mentioned before, these blue bars are the terms of trade net concessions of the US under factual scenarios. And then if we remove the trade imbalances, then the US net concessions go down substantially. So this tells us that the sentiments that some politicians in the US have about trade deficit, that sentiment has some validity. Of course, the response that they have is kind of unreasonable and we cannot make sense of it. But at least we can say that this change in trade imbalances have had a substantial impact on reciprocity. So I just want to show you this graph, which is for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is also a net giver of concessions. So the Saudi Arabia concessions are positive, and so they are basically giving a lot of concessions without receiving much in return. And that's because of the type of economy that they have. They are exporting oil, and oil is not a subject of trade agreement, so they are not receiving any concessions in oil, but they are giving concessions in all of their imports. So I put this graph here because we are interested in Iran's economy, and this shows the limitation of the WTO for countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia who are exporting oil as their major exports. And it seems like based on this idea of reciprocity, they cannot gain much in these negotiations. This is a subject of, we can explore this further, but let me also show you my last slide here that shows the network of WTO concessions. In 1995, as you see, US has a very central role. This arrows shows the net concessions given, and the thickness of the arrows shows the size of the concessions. The big recipients in 1995 were Japan, Canada, and Europe. And going forward to 2018, all of a sudden you see that this graph has changed substantially. Now, US is still the biggest grantor of these concessions, but then China, which is here, is also a significant contributor in the world, especially to Korea, Taiwan, and EU. So this can help us understand also that idea about like changes in the structure of the world economy and maybe changes in hegemonic hegemonies, and that is something that we are going to consider in future research. All right, I can stop at this point and wait for your comments and feedbacks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mostafa Beshkar, for that erudite and very informative discussion. It speaks well to the macro social welfare costs. And beside that, there's plenty of inequality in terms of who actually bears the burdens of the counterfactual cases that you discussed. Thank you very much. Let us move to the second presentation by Dr. Saleh Tabrizy. Saleh is a well-experienced researcher in trade and development, and his work is typically empirical and has the direct relationship to the economies of oil producing in Iran. Saleh is at University of Oklahoma Business School. Is a graduate of University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, a place that I recall with great fondness. Unlike Bloomington, I did not serve there, but I have many pleasant visits and wonderful Iranian scholars at that school. We're grateful, of course, to both, and Saleh, who focuses on, in a way, a reactive decision to decide about export mixture given tariffs and of course, sanctions are a form of tariff as well. Saleh, about 30 minutes, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Maasoumi, for your introduction. Um, the title of our work is Sanctions and Export Diversification, and it is focused on a set of origins that are identified as oil-rich countries in the Middle East. I was fortunate that Mostafa set up this stage already and talked about study case of Saudi Arabia, and now we can move to a more familiar ground for the analysis in this particular paper. But before I begin, I need to note two things. This is a paper on the Middle East and sanctions. And as you all know, the Middle East has been stuck in cycles of war and sanctions. And I am quite sad to see that war is back again with force. And it feels like the research that I'm doing now is rather hopeless because it was about sanctions while war is back with force. And I just need to acknowledge these. And the second thing that I would like to mention is that this work is the result of whole lot of conversations that I had with a graduate student at Central European University in Vienna. And he's now my co-author. His name is Behnam Zoghia-Rudsari. A couple of weeks ago, he graduated with his master's degree, and he's now on the market for pursuing a doctorate degree in economics. In case you're looking for a doctorate student who is highly talented, motivated, with great quantitative skills, he carries my strongest recommendations. All right, with these two notes, let's go ahead and start the presentation. There has recently been a number of studies that look at the effect of dyadic sanctions on trade. What is a dyadic sanction? I'm going to bring in a paper that was discussed previously here at IIEA, and that's a very famous paper these days. It is written by Hashem Pesaran and one of his former graduate students. There, they study the effect of sanctions on Iran, and the measure that they use is based on news coverage of sanctions that are imposed on Iran. Now, those sanctions are imposed by a host of countries. That includes the United States, it includes many European countries, and includes a host of other countries, in particular when it's under United Nations Security Council sanctions. And there you have a bunch of countries that are imposing those sanctions on Iran. Dyadic sanctions are a bit different. They look at a pair of countries at a given point in time. They look at whether or not that particular destination has imposed a sanction on a particular origin, or the other way around. So it's about pairs of countries. We'll look at this matrix that is made of pairs of countries, and we can see whether or not a country like, say, the United States has imposed a sanction on a country like Iran, whether or not a country like Germany has imposed a sanction on Iran. And then they can see different types of it, and they have published the data set. There are already 4 versions of it. It's called Global Sanction Database, and I encourage you guys to look at it in case you're interested in it. Employing dyadic sanctions, there are now a host of papers that show that these sanctions have adverse but heterogeneous effects on trade flows. There's also a small set of studies that look at the effect from sanction removals on trade flows. My work with Ali.Pay is one of those. So what we know is that the imposition of sanctions have adverse but heterogeneous effects, and there are some evidence suggesting that the removal of sanctions also have some positive effects on trade flows. Beyond trade flows, however, there have recently been other studies that look at the effect of sanctions on the extensive and the intensive margin of exports. And I will talk about one of these margins in more details, but these are not about trade flows. These are about margins of, say, exporting activities. The research that I am going to present today relates to this latter strand of research, which is focused on the margins. And in particular, we are focused in the extensive margin of exports. Let me provide an example here. I'm going to provide an example that links the extensive margin of exports to export diversification, which is the dependent variable of interest in our empirical analysis. I'm going to bring a board which is made of only two countries, and one of them exports two products, say crude petroleum and iron ore, right? Now, this country can increase its exports through two channels. It can export more crude petroleum and it can export more iron ore. Keeping the set of exports the same, they can export more of what they have already been exporting. This is an expansion on the intensive margin. On the other hand, they can go ahead and they introduce a new line of product and export that product to the rest of the world. They have already been exporting crude petroleum and iron ore. Let's say that they start exporting petrochemicals. Now, that is an expansion on the extensive margin. This product margin is the measure that we employ for export diversification. Now, is such diversification desirable? And if it is, how can countries achieve that? Well, that particular subject goes beyond the presentation that I have for today. But I would like to remind you that back in 2022, early 2022, I was fortunate to host Mostafa along with Daria Taglioni from the World Bank and Eric Werke from Simon Fraser at a IIEA webinar where they talked about the desirability and the feasibility of greater export diversification in the Middle East. And in particular, if you're interested in this topic or if your graduate students are interested in topic, this webinar is recorded and available on IIEA's website. So I encourage you guys to take a look at it. I am going to implicitly assume that export diversification is desirable and therefore improving, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. Now, for the extensive margin of exports, I'm going to rely on a measure that was introduced by Hummels and Klono in a paper that they published in American Economic Review back in 2005. And I'm going to employ the most recent version of CEPII's BACI dataset that provides us with a large matrix of trade flows. It includes more than 200 origin countries, more than 200 destination countries, and about 5,000 product lines. And these product lines are at HS6, the Harmonized System Level 6 classification. The coverage goes from 1995 to 2023. Now, some of you may have worked with such data sets. Most of you may have not worked with it. So let me provide you with two examples of HS6 products. I have here a product called HX6 code 270900. That's basically crude petroleum. And I have another one here called HS6 code 260112. That's iron ore, right? So we go ahead and we look at them at level 6. There is an aggregation level 4. There is a disaggregation level 8, but this data set is available at 6 and we keep it at 6. Then we rely on the measure that was developed by Hummels and Klono in order to compute the extensive margin across all origin destination year pairs. Again, this is a origin destination year specific measure. And we don't do it on the Middle East alone. We do it for the entire universe of the dataset. What is the measure that we are employing? Consider an origin called I and a destination called J at time T. Hummels and Klono suggests that we take the roster of products that origin I exports to destination J at time T, but then throw out the value of exports in those products from country I to country J. Keep the roster, the list of products, but throw out the value. Then go ahead and focus on the rest of the world and see how much the rest of the world has exported to that particular destination, destination J, at time T, of the products that origin I had exported. Let's go back to my example. We had a country that exports crude petroleum and iron ore, and it exports to a particular destination country. We called it country J. Now, ignore the value of that exports, but keep those two products here. Then go to the rest of the world and see how much rest of the world has exported those two products to destination J. Then normalize that amount by the entire export in all categories, product categories, beyond crude petroleum and iron ore to destination J at year T. In a sense, this measure gives you the relative importance of what origin I exports to destination J at time T without incorporating the value of that particular export. Now, let's say that at year T plus 1, origin I starts exporting not only crude petroleum and iron ore, but also petrochemicals. Now, we keep the three categories. We throw out the value. We go back to the rest of the world and see how much the rest of the world is exporting. Thankfully, petrochemical products are quite important, right? So in a sense, we can see that on the extensive margin, the origin I has now offered a more diverse exports to destination J at time T plus 1. And keep in mind that we observed this from 1995 all the way to 2023 across all origin destination pairs. Okay? So our measure of extensive margin, which is our measure of product diversification, shows the relative importance of what origin I exports to destination J at time T. It is a time-varying origin destination specific measure. All right? Now, does sanction affect such measure? There are a few channels. The first channel is that sanctions are going to affect what we generally call trade facilitation measures in an adverse manner. What are the trade facilitations? Imagine that you want to export one particular product from your country to a destination of your choice. There is a procedure for that, right? Sanctions have an adverse effect on that procedure. It makes it harder for you to start exporting. Also, as Pesaran and Laura T showed in their paper, sanctions lead to greater exchange rate volatility. This is a very important finding that is reported in their paper and has implications for those of us who are interested in international economics. Sanctions on their own are shown to increase volatility of exchange rate. Now, imagine that you are an exporter in a country that is under sanction. On the one hand, the nominal depreciation of the national currency makes imported input more expensive for you. On the other hand, because of the adverse effect on trade facilitation, you don't get to enjoy the fruits of that more depreciated sort of national currency. You don't get to export much, right? So this exchange rate volatility hurts you as an exporter. There's also policy uncertainty around this, which is related to not only domestic, but also the policy of those sending countries who have sent those sanctions on you as the receiving. And then there is the story of production technology. As a country who has been sanctioned, it is very hard for you to update your technology, so it is harder for you to introduce new products. So the channels of trade facilitation, exchange rate volatility, policy uncertainty, and the problems that you're going to have with production technology, all of them together are going to make it harder for you to introduce a new product, the petrochemical products, and add it, for instance, to your basket of crude petroleum and iron ore. Now, after we do the computation for the entire universe of origins, destinations, and years, we keep all the destinations intact, but we throw away the origins that are not identified as oil-rich nations in the Middle East. So imagine Germany. Germany was in our computation when we were computing export diversification measure, right? But now Germany is only a destination. It is no more an origin of interest. I'm throwing out everything but oil-rich countries in the Middle East. And amongst those oil-rich countries in the Middle East, there are countries that have been subject to sanctions like Iran, Iraq, and Libya. And there are countries that have not been subject to much sanctions like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and such, right? Conditional upon a whole lot of covariates under a structural gravity model, we are going to estimate the impact of sanctions on those that have been subject to those sanctions in comparison to similar countries that have not been subject to those sanctions. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to put forth a time series. And this should be the most important takeaway. Obviously, it's an example, it's an unconditional time series, but it should be the most important takeaway from my talk. Here, I have two time series. I'm picking up Germany as a destination of interest. And I'm picking up two origins, Iran and the UAE. The data begins as of 1995, and the measure for the extensive margin varies between 0 and 1. As you can see, from 1995 to 2006, both countries have been expanding upon their exported products. This is post-Iran-Iraq war and going all the way to from 1995 to 2006, right? They are increasing their export diversifications, and it's actually compatible. This is not a normalized series, by the way. It's just a good chance for us that they start at a similar point, and they go together. Now, if you recall, as of 2006, UN Security Council resolutions started to come in and set the stage for imposing multilateral sanctions on Iran. United Arab Emirates did not face such sanctions. What happens next? United Arab Emirates continues to diversify its exports to Germany, whereas Iran lags behind. Not only it lags behind, I think there's a concavity to Iran's time series, meaning that it gets worse as we approach 2023, right? So this gap that you see here may be caused by a whole lot of different factors, a lot of which we are going to control for, and sanctions. And it shows that, it illustrates that sanctions have this adverse effect on export diversification among oil-rich nations who have been subject to, in particular in this case, multilateral sanctions. All right. Now, before I move away from this, I would like to highlight this pic that you see here around JCPOA. Remember I told you that Ali Dotbey and I, we have this paper on JCPOA, sanctions removal. We actually can see that also in export diversification. It appears that sanctions removal affect export diversification. I haven't worked on this properly, but the episode that we studied suggested that there are some evidence of it, early evidence, and I can actually see that here again for Iran. But that uptake, which is then corrected for being said, what you see is that sanctions have an adverse effect on export diversification in Iran when compared to the UAE. All right? Now, let's go into the details of the empirical exercise. The origins of interests include Algeria, Bahrain, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, obviously. This is based on the classification that James Roth has in his Economics of the Middle East book. So this is not new. This is not something that we picked up. And amongst these countries, you can see that Iran, Iraq, and Libya have been subject to significant amount of sanctions during the episodes that we study, which is from 1995 to 2023. Other countries have almost received no sanctions. Now, we're going to rely on this origin destination measure for extensive margin, and we're going to introduce that into a structural gravity model. What does a structural gravity model does? It's a very simple idea. Consider two countries that are large. They are expected to trade with one another, in particular when trade cost is quite low between them. The higher the trade cost, the lower the trade flows. The smaller the size of those countries, the lower the trade flows. Yeah. So it's a story of gravity. You have two masses, think of them as two very large economies with low trade costs, and they trade with one another a lot. Case of the United States and Canada, for instance, right? And then you have two countries that are pretty small. They don't necessarily trade that much, even at low trade costs, right? Or you have two large economies and trade cost increases and you have lower trade flows. So the idea is a very familiar gravity idea that we all learned about in high school, if not beyond that, right? Now, typically structural gravity models are for trade flows, but there have been, to the best of my knowledge, at least three studies that use extensive margins rather than the actual trade flows. The examples include Dot et al. And Beast and Schraden have two papers, the most recent the most recent one appearing in the Review of International Economics. I believe it has already been published there. If not, it may be showing up soon. Now, we follow the usual practice as recommended for us, for instance, and done by Larch and co-authors or Felbermeyer and co-authors. We employ the Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimation, a la Santos, Silva, and Tenreiro. This is a very, very well-established exercise. And we cluster these standard errors at origin-destination levels. Here is our primary function. The dependent variable is the extensive margin. And I have two set of fixed effects. One of them is origin year, and the other one is destination year fixed effects. Okay. They control for something that we call multilateral trade resistance. When it comes to the exporter, the outward multilateral trade resistance, and when it comes to the importer, the inward multilateral trade resistance. Now, what is this MTR term? Imagine that you detach Canada and United States and you put them on Mars. This is an example that I believe Krugman gave a few decades ago, and recently Yotok used it. You take Canada and the United States and you put them on Mars. What would happen to them? They trade more with one another. Why? Because it is prohibitively more expensive for them to start trading with, say, Mexico, which is on planet Earth, right? These are the MTR terms, which captures the ease of trading across different markets. But beyond that, there's also a set of fixed effects that are origin destination specific. These are time invariant. So the distance, for instance, between two countries, that's almost time invariant, right? And that's there. Any sort of colonial ties, that's time invariant, that's there, right? And then to that, we add a set of time varying bilateral covariates. One of them, our sanctions measure, then joint membership in WTO, and then beyond WTO, joint membership in any sort of regional trade agreement. And remember that since I have origin year, destination year, and origin destination fixed effects, I can only incorporate time varying bilateral variables like sanctions, joint memberships in trade agreements, and these sort of things. Anything else will be absorbed by those.
Saleh, about 3 minutes.
Thank you. Now, we also have another modified functions that is a little bit more old school. It brings in some covariates like distance, GDP, contiguity, common language, and these sort of things. Not necessarily our favorite model, but some referees would like to see that perhaps for robustness purposes. Now, let's go to the results. And you can see that there are a whole lot of different numbers listed here. And I don't care about much of them except for this. In comparison with similar countries, those countries that are imposed, those countries who have received multilateral sanctions are 17% less likely. No, that would be a wrong way to say because this is not a probability logit model. Their export diversification is 17% lower compared to their peers. This is a better way. Let me rephrase. Those who have received sanctions, multilateral sanctions in particular, are 17% worse when it comes to export diversification compared to their peers. That's the adverse effect that you saw in the time series between Iran and the UAE. Now, beyond this particular point that I'm interested in, you can see that across the board, we're dealing with a negative effect. But if you want to walk away with one quantitative result, those who have been the subject of such sanctions have lower export diversifications, and the magnitude of that is around 17%. It becomes much larger, however, should you look at complete trade sanctions that is imposed on all sectors, which has been the case for not only Iraq, but also Iran. For them, that adverse effect translates to about 45%. And when it comes to partial sanctions, which has been the case for Libya and again Iran, that adverse effect is sitting around 15%. So the adverse effect of sanctions becomes much larger should sanctions move away from a partial sanction to a complete trade sanction, right? And finally, there is a host of old papers that suggest that trade policy stuff have a lag, right? So in order to make sure that our results stand, we go ahead and we also look at the lagged effects. And to give you an idea, we look at the multilateral lagged effects and complete and partial lagged effects. And this negative and adverse effect is there, okay? To conclude, we rely on a detailed data set that documents bilateral trade flows across all origin and destinations for which we have available data. We measure the extensive margin of exports using a time-varying origin-destination measure. We focus on origin countries that are identified as oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, and we keep all the destinations intact. Then we introduce dyadic sanctions, and we estimate the impact of those sanctions on the extensive margin of interest, which is our measure for export diversification under a structural gravity model. And as I said, our results suggest that export diversification among those who have been subject to the multilateral sanctions, for instance, is 17% lower when we compare it to other similar origin countries. And this impact is much larger when sanction becomes a complete sanction affecting all sectors. Thank you so very much.
Saleh Aziz, Dr. Saleh Tabrizy, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Very informative, very thought-provoking. Both the speakers. Congratulate you not only for obviously wonderful content, but also being on time. This gives us an opportunity to open the discussion and Q&A. I have in the Q&A 2 comments, one by Hashem Pesaran, the other one by Hassan Hakimian. I wonder if they would prefer to speak their points, or would they prefer me to read it? I'm happy to read both and wait for comments from the speakers. Let me see. I don't have access to. I asked that question, but I don't know whether Hashem and Hassan would like to be let to speak. Since Muhammad is not there to help me, I'm going to read first Hashem's. Okay.
Read it.
Muhammad, can you get Hashem to speak?
No, I rather you read it. I can't
Okay,
remember.
all right. All right. Then
Just
I'll read Hashem's point. Thanks for the informative talk about the global trade and your quantification of net dollar benefits costs of the current world trade system. How about the non-trade gains that US, EU, or China have benefited from their non-reciprocal trade relationships with the rest of the world? The US case is also special due to the role of US dollar as the reserve currency, for example, allowing US to borrow from the rest of the world at a much lower interest rates and to have a much higher debt to GDP that would have been possible, would have been otherwise, would not have been possible otherwise. So either of you, can you respond to that? Then I'll read Hassan's comment.
Yeah, so let me respond to that question. That's a fantastic question. So in our paper, we only look at tariffs. And so I think the first question that Hashem is asking is about what about non-trade barriers? And that's a very important question. So in order to basically evaluate the effect of non-trade barriers that they might have increased or they might have reduced over time, we would need a data set that basically measures those non-trade barriers, and we are trying to, there are some data sets and we are trying to get that and analyze it. But our guess, our conjecture is that because, especially for China, because they are suspected to have a lot of non-trade barriers, that are, some of them are hidden trade barriers. So we would think that the balance of concession is going to be even more in favor of China when you think about that China reduced its trade, like tariff barriers, but they maintain potentially, we don't know that for sure, but at least that's the common understanding of a lot of people, that China has a lot of non-tariff barriers, and that would make this agreement even less reciprocal in favor of China. But that's something that is just a conjecture based on some common understanding of how these hidden trade barriers work. But for future work, we are considering that. And about the fact that US dollar is the reserve currency, we don't have anything to say directly about that, except that maybe the reason for the reason that we have such a huge trade imbalance is because of the fact that dollar is a currency, like the reserve currency for the world. So one point that I want to make regarding that is that this system, this world order that has allowed dollar to be the reserve currency, might have been sustained and supported by this extra concessions that the U.S. has given to the rest of the world. And I think that's a very important point, that if the U.S. insists on tariff reciprocity, maybe over time it would lose its status as the dollar would lose its status as a reserve currency, and that would backfire. And that is an issue that I think deserves more attention, that US is basically messing up the system, and it looks like they might benefit in terms of trade in trade relationships, but they would lose a lot in basically eliminating or damaging the system where US can borrow for at such low rates.
All right. Saleh, would you want to address this, or the second comment by Dr. Hassan Hakimian addresses your paper?
So thank you, Dr. Hakimian, for raising this question. There are two questions that are raised here for those who don't have access to Q&A. The first question has to do with services exports, and the second question has to do with the impact on intensive margin. You not only raised a very good question, but also gave me a research idea because Baki does not have services data. So it's a commodity trade data set. It's a rich data set, but it's only limited to merchandise trade. However, the recent version of USITC's Gravity portal does include services. The data that they have starts from 2000 and goes all the way to 2021. So there is a coverage of about 20 years. And it's again a rich data set, but it's not as disaggregated. So I don't really know what would happen if I approach that data set and incorporate the services trade data into it and then re-estimate the parameters. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to countries like the UAE or Qatar, even Oman and Bahrain to some extent, exports of services, including, say, tourism, transportation, and these sort of things are of great importance. And so your point is well taken. In our data set, we don't have services trade. However, the recent version of Gravity Portal, which was actually released a few months ago, that one has it. And thank you for giving me that research idea. Regarding the second one, we did look into the intensive margin. We don't find it exciting because the effect is not necessarily that important. And plus, when people studied the impact on trade flows, they actually capture part of that intensive margins anyways. So it's not super new per se. And in many cases, the impact was not as significant as the impact on the extensive margin. That is why we started to frame this paper as a paper on sanctions and export diversification, and not looking at the intensive margin. You also raised, there is a third question that came up, that whether or not unilateral and multilateral sanctions could be distinguished from one another. And yes, they can be distinguished from one another in the data set for global sanction database. The baseline results that we have is for all sanctions, unilateral. And then the second one that I talked about, the 17% decline, that's about multilateral sanctions. So we look at both of them. But just so you know, the sanctions measure go beyond the trade sanctions. So in case you or graduate students of yours are interested in non-trade sanctions, like financial sanctions, military sanctions, travel sanctions, and these sort of things, those measures are also in global sanction database. We were interested in trade, so we focused on that, and then we looked at multilateral and unilateral, but it can go beyond that as well. Thank you so very much for raising those three questions and for giving me an idea for perhaps next paper.
Thank you, Saleh. I take it that responded to Hassan's 2 points. There is a fourth comment question by Saeed Moshiri. Thanks for the presentations. A question for Saleh. Do you also consider unregistered trades and smuggling, which are more common under the sanctions? If not, the result might be overestimated.
Brilliant question, Said John. Baki's data is based on UN Comtrade data, which is based on customs data. Now, they correct for any sort of measurement error because they have this mirroring system. But any trade that goes beyond the scope of customs data is not recorded in that data set. And you're absolutely right. We need to mention that there is a significant amount of unregistered trade and smuggling that happens when sanctions pressure increases. And those are not measured in Baki's data because those are originally based on customs data. So anything that is registered is in the data set. Now, beyond this, I think Mohammed has done some work on this, so he can talk about this. But when it comes to the informal activities, we do have evidence that sanctions increase informal activities, and that may have also consequences for smuggling and unregistered trade. I don't know of any good data set that I could employ to address that question, but your point is well taken, and we do not have a way to measure the impact.
Hassan Hakimian has a follow-up statements. Says, so the impact of JCPOA when the UN sanctions were canceled is of a special interest.
Indeed,
That's a comment.
indeed. Yeah, the sanctions removal is quite important. We know a little bit about their effects, and I don't think we know it in a structural gravity setup. So it's actually something that I have in mind to work further on in case anyone is interested in that. This is something that I have on my list. Absolutely.
So I take this as the final comment, question, anonymous attendee. Thank you for the papers. For the first paper, how does the picture change if we introduce technological change? China has been having very fast productivity growth, which has been transferred to the American consumers. The terms of trade has been favoring the U.S., particularly if we include services exports from the U.S.
So this is an excellent question because, in fact, if you look at the terms of trade of China, it has gone down over time. And that's because, most likely because of increasing productivity in China, that now we can buy Chinese exports at lower prices. And that is an excellent question. But here, the point, in fact, in another paper by the paper that I mentioned by Bone and co-authors, they do look at this as a gain for the US over time, because US terms of trade is actually improving because of productivity growth in China. But the point that we make in our paper is that trade agreements are about comparison between cooperation and cooperative and non-cooperative scenarios. That is, if you look at this particular year, like right now, if you go back to non-cooperation, what would be the effect on the terms of trade of the two countries? But it is absolutely right that US terms of trade has improved over time, but not because of tariff cuts or tariff changes. It is because of productivity change in China. And what we measure is changes in terms of trade because of tariff cuts in a given year. That's an excellent observation.
Let me just make one observation. Both tariffs and sanctions are extremely regressive burdens, and we focused on rightly on the macro effects and effects on export and other counterfactual consequences. These burdens fall disproportionately on the poor. So there is an income distribution incidence of these burdens that deserves attention. I think some of our papers before in webinars on sanctions have addressed that, at least in terms of gender, for instance. And I think your work provides a wonderful, solid basis for discussion of these and study of these questions. And hopefully we'll get to that distributional aspects even more in the future. I'm very grateful to both of you for being willing to participate and present such wonderful papers, and so clear and so informative, and to the audience, tremendous amount of participation and great discussion. So with
Yeah,
this,
time for one question.
Sure.
Yeah, so I just want to ask a quick question from Saleh. So can you look at the diversity of production within Iran? That is, sanctions have reduced diversity of Iran's export, but it might have actually increased diversity of production inside Iran, because I assume that probably imports have also gone down because of the sanctions, and diversity on the import side would be also interesting to look at. And maybe because of the sanctions, Iranian industries have become more diverse, like there is more production to substitute for imports.
There might be some work on this. Mohammed would know more, but potentially it can be done. UNIDO has a data set called Indostat, which captures a lot of production data. And I think from that we can get some HH index type measures. and look into it. Someone may have done it, I don't recall it, but I do agree with the validity of the hypothesis that because of the limited imports, you may have greater diversification within domestic production. So absolutely. And if we have time, can I ask Mostafa a question?
Go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. So this was the second time that I attended your talk, and I didn't get a chance to ask you this question in the first time. So now that we are here at IIEA, I can actually do this here. When it comes to gains from, say, joint WTO membership, what do we know about the heterogeneity when it comes to non-resource rich nations versus non-oil resource rich nations versus oil resource rich nations? What do we actually know about that? I know that oil resource rich nations benefit less, but what about that other category in between?
So what was the other category?
Those who are resource rich, but not necessarily in oil,
In
in
oil.
other mineral products.
So I think I need to know the exact industry because we have the industries we can talk about that. But in industries where trade is not subject to negotiations, right? So those countries the countries that export those products are not going to benefit much from these bilateral trade agreements, right? So yeah, and oil is one prime example. The reason that oil is so important here is, of course, that's a very large world trade, but also there is no negotiation on tariffs of those sectors. But if you have other minerals in mind, so we should see if those minerals are subject to tariff negotiations or not.
So the less likely a product being subject to such negotiations, the less is the potential gain from the membership.
Yeah, so the membership, yeah, basically you cannot gain from tariff cuts or more market access on those in those sectors.
And the cascading effect is rather limited for them.
What cascading? So basically, they have only concessions to give and nothing to receive. Basically, if you are exporting mostly oil, for example, and that limits the benefit of these agreements for this kind of countries.
Thank you. That addresses my question. Thank you.
All right. I think with that, in the interest of time, we will end this webinar, and we look forward to seeing it on YouTube. And thank you so much, both to the speakers and the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for having us.
Have a good one. Take care.